I want to introduce Laurette Bennhold-Samaan, who is, for me, a godsend, connected with me early on in our launch of this program. I've not met you in person yet, Laurette, but we've had a lot of conversations, and I'm just in awe of your career as an intercultural expert. Laurette literally wrote the book at Peace Corps on Culture Matters, and was Peace Corps' first intercultural expert back in the 90s. So Laurette, it's really my pleasure to introduce you, put in a plug for the current consulting work you're doing, and allow you to say hello and introduce your panel today and the topic.
Great, thanks Dan. It's wonderful to be here. It's really an honor and privilege to work with Peace Corps in all the different capacities that I've done, and it's always great. So it's wonderful to see all of you here and join us. Thank you. And we do have a really distinguished panel, which I'll be introducing in 1 minute. I know I've personally experienced reentry a few times in my life, and even though I researched it, I write about it, I know about it intellectually, it's always still really emotional and extremely challenging. And as we know that volunteers who go live in another country will experience some form of culture shock, and a vast majority, mostly all of them, come through that stress successfully. And there's evidence of that they grow from their experience, and that it leads to intellectual maturity and more flexibility, creativity, enhanced global mindset and global perspective. So we hope all of you evacuated volunteers have that on your resumes already. But when people return home after this adjustment period, which can be called reverse culture shock, it can be called reentry, it can be called transition stress. There's lots of different terms for it, and it hasn't been researched as much, but we do know that they're really, really stressful periods. They're even more severe and even more protracted than the culture shock, and it tends to set in much quicker. And then let's add COVID on top of that. So, and a metaphor, and where the term reentry actually has come from, is from the the space industry. And if you think about when the space shuttle takes off, it leaves the atmosphere, it goes up and enters space, and it's far less stressed on the space shuttle and on the people. But when it returns back into the atmosphere, there's much more stress on it, and there's an actual jolt, and there's a re-entry when it comes back. And that's where the term re-entry actually originates from. So every person's experience is different, yet there are some common threads. And before we get I introduce the panelists, I'd like to get a sense as to who's on the call. So if you haven't had a chance to type into the chat where you served and what years you've served, because I believe we have some not evacuated volunteers on the call as well, please do so, and in the chat. And we're going to also be asking you some chat questions. So if you would prefer to remain anonymous for those questions, you can always go up into the top right-hand corner of your picture where there are 3 dots, and you can rename yourself, and you can rename yourself to a dot, which then would make you anonymous. I also want to ask you a polling question. So if you could just let me know, do you see the poll on the screen, Dan? So if you identify, we just want to kind of get a sense as to age, person of color, if you served as a volunteer, if you're a member of the LGBTQI community. And I will be ending the polling in 3 seconds. So if you can vote for as many as you want. 3, 2, 1, end polling. I'm sharing results. You should be able to see the results. So we have most are under 25, most are under 25, actually 25% are under 25 and 25% are between 25 and 50. And we have 50% are over the age. Oh, it looks like only 4 people voted. I was going to say 50% are over the age of 50. I didn't think that's right. Okay, so let's launch it again and let's have everybody vote. So you should see it now and you should be able to vote. And you can choose as many as you want. We know identity is complex. Okay, I see 16, 18, 19, 20 people, 22 people. Okay, there we go. So if you haven't voted yet, I'm going to close the polls. 3, 2, 1. I'm ending it. I'm sharing the results. So now we can see that most of you are between the ages of 25 and 50, followed by, next is over the age of 51, followed by people of color, followed by under 25, and then LGBT community. Great. And then we have another polling question as to which of the best statements describes your reentry currently right now. And if you want to think back to your reentry when you came back as a volunteer. Okay, I will close the polls. So if you haven't voted, actually you're seeing the questions live here. So most of you, almost 60% of you said harder than expected. And that's exactly typically what we see, and that's what this conversation is about today, that it's generally much, much harder than people expect. So we have a great panel together. We put together, we have a very diverse panel, which I'm very pleased about. We have people of color, we have a person who's a couple, we have LGBTQI represented, we have age represented, we have gender represented. So I would like each of the panelists to introduce themselves. I'm going to ask Kathy to go first. Kathy and I actually met at Peace Corps. Kathy and I have been professional colleagues and friends ever since. So if you can unmute yourself, Kathy. Kathy's from California and served with her husband in Papua New Guinea. Kathy, tell us a little bit about yourself, where you served, and also how did your service impact or change your life?
Well, welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me, Laurette and Dan. I'm Kathy Marcove. I was a Peace Corps volunteer a long time ago from 1988 to 1990 in Papua New Guinea in the South Pacific. I went with my husband. We were newly married, and we served as a rural community development couple. My husband was in agriculture extension, and I worked in health and nutrition education. And we were there for 2.5 years. We stayed on a little longer to do some work at the headquarters. And I'm sorry, what was the second part? How did it impact
your life?
You know, I think it's colored every aspect of my life. So as Laurette mentioned, we met, we were both training consultants for Peace Corps in the Office of Staging. I worked for that division for 15 years as a contractor. And then I was a pre-service training director in the Slovak Republic the summer of 1997. And so I've been very involved, but I think it's impacted how I've lived my life, how I've raised my children, the decisions I've made about lifestyle. It certainly taught me a lot, from gardening to, again, raising my children, breastfeeding my kids, a whole bunch of things. And it's always been sort of a very interest point for people when I've applied for jobs or topics of conversation. It's been a wonderful addition to my life. And honestly, I'd like to do it again.
Great. Thanks, Kathy. Shannon, you and I actually haven't met. If everybody could mute if they're not speaking, that would be great. Shannon has.
Sorry, Laurette, I accidentally muted you when I muted everybody. Just repeat that last bit.
Okay. So Shannon, if you could introduce yourself. Shannon and I have not met face to face, unfortunately. Shannon has the experience of being evacuated from Burundi and then also placed as a volunteer in another country. So Shannon, tell us a little bit about yourself, and thanks for joining the panel.
Sure, no problem. My name's Shannon England, and I served from 93 to 95. I was, as Laurette mentioned, evacuated from Burundi due to civil war, so I was there for 4 months. I was lucky enough at the time to get an in-service transfer to Gabon, where I served out the remainder of my service. I was trained as a fish head, so I went out to Burundi and then in Gabon and did aquaculture extension. But while I was there, I developed an interest in public health, and then that carried over into the career that I had in international development. I ended up getting a master's degree in public health and health communication, health education, and ended up working for a number of organizations doing global health around the world, including PSI and Management Sciences for Health. I'm now working at Internews and do media development. So happy to share my experiences with Reentry.
Great, thanks, Shannon. So as we can see, it really has impacted, as we know, Peace Corps impacts people's lives in so many different ways throughout their entire life. So Willis, why don't you go next? I'm gonna unmute you. There we go, I've unmuted you.
Thanks. Good afternoon, all. My name is Willis Mitchell. I was a PCV in Ghana from 87 to 89. Upon return, took a little time off, but subsequently took on employment with Peace Corps over the course of 6 years, from recruitment to evaluation specialist and country desk officer. While I was not evacuated from any country, certainly I know the fears associated with that within the Peace Corps community. As a country desk officer, I did have an evacuation, albeit not out of the country, but out of the local area. I was a country desk officer for Gabon, Shannon, as well as Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, and Sao Tome. And we did have some evacuations in Cape Verde due to volcano eruptions, but stayed within country. I would say that my experience certainly sort of solidified my purpose of being. I mean, I think we go through life many of years not really understanding what sole purpose that we have here. And I can say that certainly being of service is my ultimate and priority purpose for being here. And so having gone through college and the portfolio wasn't quite ready for the working market, made the decision to join the Peace Corps. Didn't know a lot about it, but learned a lot in the process. And so I will have to say that definitely my years of experience as a volunteer and as a staff really solidified my whole purpose of being. And so everything that I do, I'm searching for an opportunity to realize exactly what that means and how can I impact or make a change. So it's happy to speak to you today about my experiences, but truly it is correct. We all had these experiences, and that's what's unique about Peace Corps. You go to different parts of the world, have had different experiences, but we're all able to meet back in the center lane of having similar experiences. So it's my pleasure to be with you today.
Great, thanks, Willis. And what really resonated with me was that your call to service. People have said that time and time again once they've served in Peace Corps, that they feel that they have that ingrained in them for the rest of their life. So thanks, Willis. So our last panelist, Jamal. So Jamal came to me by way of the Humans of New York. So those of you who don't know Humans of New York, it's a New York City photo blog in which he was named and got over 6,000 views. So with that, Jamal, if you could introduce yourself, please, and also tell us how Peace Corps got you where you are in Peace Corps and what your impact feels.
Sure. So I'm Jamal Marcelin. Good afternoon, everybody. I served as a volunteer in Ukraine from 2018 until March of 2020 when I was evacuated. I was a TEFL volunteer in a small mining town in central Ukraine. And my service has impacted my life in that it really taught me how important it is to advocate for yourself and how important it is to speak up. Mainly because, living as a Black man, the only person of color in my town of about 80,000 people, there were often times when unsavory, racially motivated incidents would happen. in my town and also throughout the country when I was traveling. And it often took me speaking up and shouting out about the issues that were going on in order for people to stand up with me. And so it really taught me to be a lot more vocal about the things that I go through and the things that people like me go through in majority white spaces.
Great, thanks, Jamal. So you can see what an incredible panel we have. So I'm really excited to hear more from each of you. So now we're going to focus more on the reentry, and I'd like each of the panelists to tell us about your reentry experience specifically. And Jamal, since you're the most recent one, let's start with you.
Sure. Okay. So reentry for me was really strange because we all, got the news that we were being evacuated, and so we all gathered in the capital and spent about 5 days there, like trying to process what was going on. Everything was very fresh for us, and then eventually we flew back to the United States, and a lot of us we were very confused. We didn't know what was going on because not only had we been evacuated, but we were coming back into an environment where a major global pandemic was affecting every aspect of life. So we were trying to figure out, especially me, I was trying to figure out, what was going to be the next step in my life, while also trying to make sure that I could remain safe and my family could remain safe. And so before leaving Peace Corps in March, I'd had a plan set up for what I wanted to do for my future. I knew exactly what I was going to do after COSing. And then all of that obviously had to be dashed to the wind as soon as we got the order that we were being evacuated. So I was really, when I landed in New York, I was really lost. I felt really sad and really anxious about what was coming up for me. I didn't know what was going on. And so I found myself scrambling a lot and trying to latch on to anything that I could that could give me a sense of normalcy. And a lot of people in my cohort felt that as well because we made sure to stay in touch with each other. Now, after a few months, I'm glad that I finally have a plan for the future, and I'm starting to be able to do that. I will be moving to South Korea later in the year to continue teaching. But I know that a lot of people in my cohort are still scrambling and they're still trying to figure out what's going on because obviously having to be pulled away from their communities and pulled away from all of their friends in Ukraine and then brought back into a confusing and tough situation. It's very, very hard for your mental health to be able to stay above water in a situation like that.
Certainly is the chaos and the wanting normalcy and not being able to have it is against human nature. So it's very challenging. Mm-hmm. Shannon, Willis, or Kathy, can you tell us about your reentry experience?
Well, for me, it came in waves. I'm originally from the Mississippi Gulf Coast, so small town. USA, and I heard the stories about your family's response. As it be, I was a first generation college graduate, and so even the challenge of going away for 2 years and going to Africa and places you can't pronounce and the various diseases. I was sick a lot when I was a Peace Corps volunteer, and so I even spent some time in recovery and had surgeries post-return. But my initial experience was getting my family to understand what had just transpired and how it affected me. And I came back with this melodic West African accent. And so even within the community, trying to extend service and working with youth and doing community-focused events, there was just a lack of understanding of even Black Africa and being an African-American in Africa. And even to this day, I manipulate the process pretty easily in terms of interacting with Africans. And that is ironically my foster son. He's from Africa. And he chose to relocate with me and disregard his family. And so having conversations around living in Africa and how for young people people don't live in trees and people do wear clothes. And so it was in waves. So I did take an opportunity to do some traveling for about a year, connecting with RPCV friends up the East Coast and in the Midwest. And after about a year, it became important to actually, the stipend was going away. And so I need to get a job. And so with that, relocating to Los Angeles, which was, West Coast, and the prices were different, the people were acting differently. And so I think it came in droves. Obviously you survive that and it makes you a stronger person in the process. But nevertheless, a lot of my transition sort of came in waves, with the experiences being a little shocking initially, but, certainly having lived through malaria 4 times and being threatened to be, sent home for medical reasons, a lot of experiences that really toughened me for my reentry, but it did come in waves in terms of what that experience looked like.
And I think many of us experience the helping others understand your experience, and that really trying to articulate that, which is always a challenge. And that reentry isn't linear, as you said. It's not a linear experience. It doesn't come all at the same time. It comes throughout. It can come throughout your reentry experience, and hopefully it will make you much stronger, as you said. Shannon?
Yeah, hi. So my reentry experience was interesting. I spent back in the day we used to get a little stipend, so I did spend some of my money, my stipend money, traveling with a fellow Peace Corps volunteer, and we kind of slow traveled back from Africa to Kenya, to Greece, to Spain, to England before we landed back in the United States. And for me, there were 2 major challenges. I spent all my money, so the first thing I had to figure out was what was my career going to be and what was my job going to be. So I was very focused on that. And the second was I had gone through a lot of personal changes in Peace Corps in addition to professional changes. I sort of came out to myself for the first time in Peace Corps, but I had this ex-boyfriend back home waiting for me, wanting to get married. And I was really still struggling with my identity. I was wondering what it meant that I identified as bisexual and how is that going to play out in my life. I was struggling with how to connect with the LGBT community back in the United States. And I grew up in a very small conservative town in the Midwest, so I knew going back to that place was not going to work for me. So I had lived in DC before, and that's where I decided to make my home. So it was a very confusing time, but it was also a very exciting time for me. I remember just feeling like, the world there were so many things I could do, but I wasn't quite exactly sure how to do it or how to connect with it. And I found actually that connecting with other Peace Corps volunteers was really helpful. I actually reached out to the RPCV LGBT DC group, which is like my favorite list of acronyms together, and met some fellow Peace Corps volunteers, and that was extraordinarily helpful. In fact, one of the first Pride parades I ever went to was with the RPCV LGBT DC group, and it was a really empowering experience. So I guess my advice to people going through reentry would be to stay connected to your fellow Peace Corps volunteers, both the ones you served with, but also reach out to some of the other RPCV groups that are out there, because most places have them, and almost everyone I know has found a lot of value in those groups, either whether it's an affinity group or a country of service group. And those connections, some of those people that I met when I first came back, I'm still friends with 25 years later, which is a testament to how important it was to me.
Great, thanks, Shannon. I think you bring up some really important points in terms of struggles, in terms of identity. Oftentimes when people are either going overseas or coming back is when they're questioning life, they're questioning their identity, they're questioning their relationships. And then the importance that you mentioned about having a support network and finding that support network within Peace Corps or outside. Kathy.
Oh, well, I can echo some of the things that we've heard before. Of course, I serve with my husband, so in some ways that made things easier in the sense that, I had someone who understood exactly what I went through. But then there were 2 people going through the reentry process together, and we weren't always aligned in terms of where we were. But, one of the things that I always feel felt sorry about for people who get evacuated is, I know I always was looking forward to the period of travel using my readjustment allowance. But I will say that although we had great plans, we were exhausted. And I had been very, very sick in the Peace Corps. I had typhoid fever. My husband had malaria, so I can mimic what Willis was saying. We did not travel for very long. In fact, I remember we arrived in Hong Kong, and all we wanted to do was get to a bed. It was very expensive, and literally we arrived, and 6 hours later we're on a plane home. And so this long 6-month travel was only a few weeks because we were just so darn tired, and we weren't well. So when we came home, we were exhausted, we were sick. We had a lot of family issues that we had to deal with, kind of big things that needed to be done with. It was a recession. Not as deep as the Great Recession. We're not 100% sure what this is going to look like, but there weren't a lot of jobs, and we were living in Colorado at the time. And life in the United States seemed overwhelming to us. And I know Willis and I, when we talked earlier, just going to the grocery store I had like a panic attack. I never had panic attacks before, but I go to the grocery store and all of these things that were available and all of this consumerism, and everybody was wearing denim. I thought, oh my goodness, it's like the uniform of people in this culture. I felt like an alien coming back to my own culture. And I missed the connections with the community that I lived in Papua New Guinea. They lived in large family groups, and I was lonely a lot of the times. I hadn't been really alone for 2.5 years. And so it was overwhelming, but it gave me a unique perspective on our culture in the United States. And I realized by feeling like a stranger in my own country, it goes back again to what Willis said, is how can I serve? And this was really the meaning that I took out of my reentry. I often think of reentry akin to a process of grief. And to be successful in overcoming any kind of grief or loss, it's really finding meaning in what that experience was for you. And so for me, I think I will echo what Willis said. How can I serve? I worked for nonprofits, I volunteered, I worked for Peace Corps. I found ways to serve. And I would say for people coming back now, while you may not be able to get on a plane and go to another country, there's a whole bunch of stuff that needs to happen right here in your neighborhood of taking that spirit of service and applying it to our country, which is really in need right now.
Great, thanks, Kathy. You brought up a lot of important points as well in terms of the overwhelming feeling that volunteers and people feel, that you come back and you're just, what was normal before just doesn't seem normal because you've changed, your environment's changed. So that going to the grocery store, I remember, just as you said, going down the aisle and seeing how many laundry soaps can you have? It just was shocking. And as you said, feeling like an alien even coming back, and then the finding meaning, the importance of that. So quickly in the chat, I'd like to get the people involved. So I'm typing in the chat, what has surprised you about returning home? So anybody in the chat can just type in the chat what surprised you. If you want to remain anonymous, again, you can put in a dot for your name. And then we're going to move into some of the feelings of reentry. So there are usually many feelings associated with reentry. As we've said, sudden reentry is even more difficult. As Kathy said, there's a feeling oftentimes of alienation. There can also be a feeling of anger, and that you're discovering you're a stranger in your own home, quote home, or your own culture. And then COVID has also so much changed the culture right now that you're entering home to. So what surprised you? Type into the chat. So we have toothpaste, cereal. People didn't want to talk or hear about my experiences, the size of the grocery store, isolating quarantine, felt misunderstood by the people that I love. How come we don't greet everyone? I greeted everyone on the Philadelphia subway, saw the looks and got afraid I'd be arrested. I was surprised at how big the houses and how wide the streets were. I remember struggling with how much waste I saw around me, needless expense, extravagance. how difficult it was to get a job, even with my Peace Corps experience. People are relating to the greetings, the lack of collective culture in America. We're much more individualistic here, and in Morocco, everyone is collectivist. And the people in my family told me I should be happy when I was home, when I didn't want to go home, and I wanted to be back in my community. I had a hard time adjusting to the grief of what I had lost. Traffic, complaints, petty complaints about it being too humid, the dishwasher being too loud, how little time people actually spend with each other, neighbors that weren't interested, who didn't trust me. Coming home as an evacuee has not been easy. In some ways, Peace Corps service was good preparation for the isolation of quarantine. Entertaining ourselves, communicating with people, and you can read through the rest. The concept of surplus, individualism, and so on. The lack of focus on the family. So we can see that there's a lot of emotion around here, which leads us to the next polling question, which is, which of the following best describes your feelings about re-entry? And you can choose as many as you'd like.
It's only letting us pick one.
Oh. Okay, well then choose the one that describes it the most. Okay, I am sharing the results. So we have about 30% said emotional. It was extremely emotional, which is a typical word that we hear in reentry, that there's just so much emotion of leaving the place behind and coming into a place where you're not quite fitting in as you used to. Followed by frustrated. And again, I could imagine that evacuees have a certain nuance to that reentry, so that frustration is probably even more there, and it's sudden, so that also can lead to frustration. And then irritable. That's also a very common one, that people are just much more irritable because they're just much more on edge and sensitive. And before we get into kind of coping mechanisms, it's very interesting that research has shown that the individuals who have been most successful in adjusting to the new culture are actually the ones that have the greater difficulty in readapting to their old culture. So it almost sounds counterintuitive. You'd think if they adjust so well to the new culture, they're going to be flexible and adjust so well back to their home country. But what research finds is that because they've adjusted so well to the new culture, and of course there's culture shock, but they get through it and they learn from it, and they have learning agility, and is that they're so used to that adaptation, and the concept of coming home should sound so easy because they're coming back to something that's familiar. So it's not only unexpected, and you're used to having adjusted in that new culture, you assume it's going to be the same. So I'd like to ask the panelists, we're going to move into kind of diversity and identity. And again, we have a very diverse panel. I'd like to ask each of you questions as to, Jamal, I'd like you to think about how being an African-American male in a predominantly white country impacted your service, and especially coming home. And then Willis, how did being Black in an African country impact your service, and mostly about your return home? And Shannon, you mentioned that you came out. So you could tell us, came out in Peace Corps, and how was that experience for you coming back? And tell us a little bit about your transition back in regard to your identity. So Willis, you're unmuted. Why don't you go first?
Yeah, I would have to say that, and particularly having been a recruiter and evaluation specialist for potential recruits, I mean, it does hold true. I mean, back in the 60s when the program started, the whole movement as it relates to going back to the motherland, if you will, was a phrase. And, you know, there's always a caution because that was not my experience and certainly not currently the experience. But I will say that, you know, I've managed to make a connection as a kindred spirit, if you will, with African people. But definitely here in the United States, there is some aspect of a distrust or a disingenuous relationship between Africans and African Americans. And I think it's primarily based on the lack of education. So having been a volunteer in Africa, that certainly helped me to understand the differences in those communities. But there's also the reality. I mean, I remember when I reacted so profoundly when my compadre, you know, they paired us up with host country nationals. He referred to me as a white man. And clearly, you know, particularly coming from him, it was very disappointing. And so over the course of the 2 years and even now, you know, going a Black man being in Black Africa is just not necessarily an immediate connection as far as a kindred spirit, because with the majority of the Peace Corps volunteers being none of color, and it was only 2 of us in my class of 51. And then, of course, we're dispersed throughout the country, and the few that's out remaining in the country, either after we left or before we got to our post. So it was enlightening. It's very educational in the sense that it's just not necessarily going back to the motherland as I had heard from the earliest 60s. It's a predominantly white elite group that traditionally have done Peace Corps, is the perception. And I didn't come from neither. So being in Black Africa wasn't necessarily just a given that it was an easy transition for me.
Great, thank you for that. Hard to hear some of that experience you had. I'm sure it was hard for you as well. Jamal, you're on mute. I can unmute you. There you go.
Okay, so being a Black person in a mostly white country in a mostly white town, one of the ways in which it impacted my service was that it made me a lot more vocal about things that I will not stand for, and about things that are bothering me. In the beginning of my service, or even before my service, I was a lot shyer. I was a lot more willing to just accept things that came to me and to just live with them, regardless of how much they bothered me. It would take me a very, very long time to speak up. But at a certain point, when the racial incidents started coming day after day, week after week, it became too much, and I realized that I needed to say something, otherwise nothing would change. And for me, I realized that it would be better to speak up and be yelled at and be talked down to than to not speak up at all and have people put me down, situations put me down, and then have people say later on that I enjoyed it. And so it was really, really important for me to learn that. In addition to that, I learned how to be more reliant on people and how to lean on people a lot more, which for me, I think is a really great strength. Because before service, I was very much the kind of person to kind of shoulder everything and just go through everything on my own. And I realized that it's a much more important skill and a much better skill to be able to look around you and see the wealth of people that you have around you to help you get through any kind of situation. I can't count the amount of volunteers and even even Ukrainians within my community and within the greater Ukraine community who stood up for me when violent and nonviolent incidents happened, who really wanted to be there for me, who welcomed me into their homes, and who really wanted to make life better for me in Ukraine, even though there were some people who would have rather to not see me in their community or see me around them at all. In addition to that, this goes along with that as well. It made me care more about community and care more about like being within a larger group. In my opinion, and in the opinions of a lot of other volunteers as well, Ukraine is a very collectivist society. Especially within smaller communities. People look out for each other, they take care of each other. When things get hard, they help to put food on each other's tables. And that was something that I hadn't really experienced in America at all, especially growing up as an only child in a single parent home. So going to Ukraine really made me understand the importance of family and the importance of people being there for you and relying on people. So it's an experience I really wouldn't change for the world, despite all of the things that I went through on account of my racial background.
It's good to hear that it's an experience that you wouldn't change. A question is, there's been a lot of discussion recently in our community about the white savior complex. And so Jamal and Willis, have you found it difficult to reflect positively on your experience because of what some would perceive to be a Western or a white approach to the international development work?
Should I go first?
Sure.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so this was a topic that actually came up quite a bit during my service, like between volunteers. Yeah, it's a very difficult discussion to have, especially like being a Black person and like having other people say, oh, well, you're, subscribing to like the white savior model, which was very strange to me because I had never thought of myself as a white savior. Very weird. I don't know. The way that I looked at it was that I was doing as much good as I could within the capacity that I could. And I spent a lot of my time learning about my community and learning about Ukraine in general. Never, I can say honestly that never in my time in Ukraine did I come in and say, here I am to fix all of your problems. I'm going to come in and I'm going to change everything around. I'm going to make everybody rich. I'm going to pave all the roads. That was never my thing. I did know volunteers like that. But I personally, even though I may have been part of that kind of model or that complex, personally, I did whatever I could to ensure that I was approaching my community with humility and with the utmost sensitivity. So.
Thanks. Mm-hmm. Willis, any comment to add, to share? I look back positively on your experience, or how do you frame that?
Right. I mean, I would only say that, and I wouldn't identify it as a white savior complex, but I would say that from my own personal experience, and I had a lot of challenges with my placement, and there were a couple of alternatives that were recommended, but got caught up in some political conversations. But I was able to understand pretty easily that while what I call the monumental syndrome, that a lot of the Peace Corps volunteers, and with the majority being none of color, needed to create an edifice or to do something pretty drastic, because 2 years is just not enough time to do anything that's hugely sustainable. But I actually pulled that back to really address the felt needs of my community. And so I would say I would do the opposite of the white savior who was going to come in and take over, but nevertheless sort of talk to the people and figure out exactly what it is that they desired to do versus what I thought that they needed to do to move to the next level. So I did the opposite. Although I had experiences as it relates to race, but the opposite in terms of making a difference in my community.
Mm-hmm. Which is very important. So let's move into, thank you for both of your discussions, especially in today's world with all of the social injustice being addressed. It's really important. Shannon, I'd like to move to you in terms of question that was asked as to your transition back with regard to your identity, and how was that for you? Before then we move into coping strategies and close the call.
Sure. Well, I mean, I was 23 when I joined Peace Corps, and it was 1993, just for context for people who are younger. And the world was a really different place. This is pre-Ellen and pre the internet, even as we know it. So I grew up in a really conservative part of the country, and I'd gone to a pretty conservative college. And when I joined Peace Corps, it was actually the first time, you know, in addition to all the cross-cultural issues I was dealing with, getting to know my community in Burundi and then in Gabon, I actually met out queer Peace Corps volunteers who were very open with me, and they come from California, and it threw me for a loop. I was really, I had not really met any other out people before. Nobody had ever come out to me before. I know that sounds crazy in today's day and age, but it was true for me. And I had my first kind of, you know, romantic same-sex attractions to other women. And then, you know, for me, once that floodgate kind of opened, it opened, and I was like finding myself attracted to a lot of different women. And it was even more confusing for me because I am bisexual. So, you know, I'd had a lot of relationships with men in the past, and that had been very successful. So I found myself in a place that was very homophobic. It was not safe to be out in Peace Corps in Gabon at the time. There were other queer volunteers that we kind of like formed a little community to help each other and sort of like, you know, shared tips and stuff. But it was a very scary time for me being a volunteer, and also just trying to figure out what did this mean for me, and, you know, is this real? I mean, I just had a whole host of questions. When I came back, I was actually really pleased. I ended up, you know, as I mentioned, I joined the RPCV LGBT group, and I met many, many more volunteers that sort of helped me to sort of reintegrate. And so that experience was really formative for me. And also, one of my biggest fears, you know, amongst many fears I had, was that I was never going to be able to get a job in international development. My life was over, and if I pursued this path of dating women, then like my life was ruined. And it really, meeting other volunteers who had successful careers, who were out at work, who were, you know, it really just helped me to realize that was kind of a ridiculous fear, or at least it was not as big a fear as I needed to be worried about, that there was a potential path forward for me. And that was extraordinarily helpful. And I know Peace Corps at the time was just then, you know, developing resources for LGBT volunteers, and I, you know, got access to some of those, which was also very helpful. So yeah, so I guess that was kind of my experience. I mean, I was really, Peace Corps was an amazing, life-changing experience for me on so many levels, both personal and professional. And you asked the question, like, you know, how did Peace Corps change your life? And I would say that it changed my life in so many ways. You know, I ended up married to a woman who also does work in the field of international development, who's also a cross-culturalist, who also speaks multiple languages. And if you had asked the 23-year-old me, like, is this going to be possible for you? I would have said no, but it happened, you know, and I'm immensely grateful for my time in Peace Corps.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And how you were helped to reintegrate into the world, and the assumptions that you made now looking back are kind of you'll never be able to get into this career, and all of this are actually helpful for people to hear, and how you coped. Which moves us into the last part. I want to do another polling question about coping, about how do you all, what are coping strategies? So, oops, hold on, let me relaunch the poll. Okay, so how have you been taking care of yourself? We believe that you can choose as many as you can, we hope so. So take a look first and look at the list there. And I know we have some country directors on the call, so if you want to also think about how you have helped volunteers in coping strategies, what worked, what didn't work. And as a panelist, Kathy, I'd like you to ask you first as to how did you and your husband cope? How did you take care of yourself? What worked? What didn't work? So I'm going to end the polling questions in 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1, vote. And so most of you, 80% of you are attending webinars like this. We're grateful for that. Then you're also doing self-care and exercising at 70%, and forging, mending relationships and family and friendships at 60%. And about 50% are connecting with other volunteers and cooking. Great. Here are the results. So Kathy, talk to us about your reentry in terms of coping strategies and what worked and what didn't.
Yeah, well, I mentioned that, you know, we had some health issues, so that was probably the first thing. We came home right before Christmas, so it was sort of a holiday period in the country. So, you know, we had the luxury of a few weeks of just being with family, a lot of travel and that kind of thing, but then taking care of ourselves. You know, I needed some physical therapy. I had some things that were not right physically. So lots of doctor's appointments and trying to figure out how to take care of that. Honestly, it's great to be a couple, but it's also challenging. We did some marriage counseling after that, just because we were going through a lot of different things. I mean, don't be shy to reach out for professional help. Because it's not just the reentry process, but there may be some other things going on in your life. And trust me, this is a challenging time in our country. Everyone is needing someone to talk to about these things. So don't be shy about that. But you know, what didn't work was trying to honestly live in my parents-in-law's home and try to find work in Colorado, because there just was not work that was interesting to us. Sure, there were lots of things we could have done, but we still had that idea we wanted to be connected to some things like we did in Peace Corps. So we moved to Washington, D.C., and a couple of things that really were helpful. We looked for opportunities to talk about our experience in a variety of different ways, from, you know, a cousin's church youth group to actually going back to the country that we had, the country desk, Willis, so you worked on that for Papua New Guinea. We were asked to go to a couple of pre-service trainings and talk about our experience. I'm stuck. I don't know. Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. So terrible picture. Sorry about that. But, you know, being able to talk about our experience, connecting with people from Papua New Guinea or the South Pacific, and finding ways to continue to use the language, and connecting with returned Peace Corps volunteers. So for us, moving to DC, you know, right there, my husband worked at the agency. We actually were able to be very close with some people we served with. So keeping in contact with other people going through the same thing or similar things is really important.
Great. Thanks, Kathy. Shannon, what about you? How did you cope, take care of yourself? And then also, Kathy brought up a great recommendation to newly evacuated volunteers. So if you could also give a recommendation.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, coping was, on the career side, one of the things that really helped, and I always tell people to do, is to really network. And I know people say that and they're like, what does that mean? And I think what it means is basically anyone you know who's doing anything remotely related to anything you might want to do, ask them for an informational interview. And don't ask them for a job. Ask them for 20 minutes of their time. You can do it on Zoom, coffee. And at the end of the 20 minutes, people love to say yes to this because they love to help other people and they want to talk about themselves. And you will learn as you're listening to them, I don't think I want to do that, or that sounds like crazy, or whatever, but it doesn't matter. You're listening and learning. And then at the end, what you can say is, can you give me 3 names of somebody I can talk to that you might recommend that I talk to that could help me? And that, I think, was the way that it really helped me to kind of advance in my career, is that I kept the networking going and kept meeting more and more people. And then eventually one of those connections led to a job where somebody said, you know what, I've got this job that would be perfect for you. Would you like to apply? So I recommend that for people on the career front. On the reentry part, I like the advice of finding places you can talk about your experience. And I think other RPCV groups are the best places I ever found. So that was really helpful. And then staying in touch with my fellow volunteers was really helpful via phone or, whatever. But I thought that was, we would call each other frequently and say, and listen to each other, because there was a lot that only we would understand that nobody else would understand.
Great, thanks, Shannon. Jamal, what about you? Coping and recommendation for the evacuees.
Sure, yeah. So some of the things that have worked for me and other people in my cohort, like we often, like maybe once a week, twice a week, we get together and we like actively remember like things that happened to us while in service, whether they be like scary things that happened or really fun things or fun, scary things. And so it's a really like painful thing to do. Sometimes to like remember that kind of stuff and like ache and really long for that time back. But it really has helped me and other volunteers in my cohort to fully process everything that happened and think about our service in a really holistic way. So I for sure would recommend that. Keeping a journal, especially during this period of quarantine, and just writing down like how you feel and how you remember your service and writing memories down. That also really helps because a lot of the things that happened to me, I know in Ukraine seemed kind of surreal, and writing them down now is really helping me to face them head on and really process what happened. In addition to that, I still talk to my main counterpart a lot. And so that's been really like healing and therapeutic to see that like, even though it seems kind of like the world ended, life continued, right? And so like I talk to her very often. We even still have like a virtual English club going on with some of our students, and that's really fun. And then in addition to that, planning like a Peace Corps volunteer reunion with volunteers from my cohort. And so I'm really looking forward to that. And that has been giving me a lot of hope and excitement as well.
Great. Thanks, Jamal. Willis, what do you recommend for the evacuated volunteers? What's your recommendation?
I would certainly reiterate staying connected. I mean, I'm actually the opposite. I'm just an introvert and very reflective, and even through a spiritual journey was able to nourish, my needs in terms of landing in a safe space. But I think definitely while I did do some traveling initially and connected with folks that I met during my experience, that was very helpful. So I think between the networking and connecting with others where there's shared values is very critical in terms of your success and coping. And then otherwise spirituality, I've always been involved in the church and singing and all those kinds of things. And so making a connection back to the church, which offered other opportunities to serve. So I think it's a combination for me. It is being more reflective and introspective, but then just the same, we all need someone. And so be sure that you're making those connections with those folks who have shared values with you.
Great, thank you. So thank you all. As we've heard, we had an incredible panel, rich. We could have had this for a full day, which would have been my dream, obviously, because it was just so full of information and rich. And I want to just close by saying that reentry really should not be taken lightly. People are dealing with a lot. They're dealing with their self-identity, with cultural identity, with relationships, with role changes, family expectations of society. You all are dealing with COVID, the list goes on. And reentry, coming back into one's culture is a very difficult experience, as are most new experiences, but there also are resources out there to support you. So even though it's painful, we hope it will lead to new self-understanding as well as personal growth and even a new beginning, a new outlook on your life and on the culture. So I will stay on a few minutes if anybody has any questions or would like to stay on, but I also am sensitive to time. So those who need to drop, thank you so much for joining, and extreme thank you to the panelists. It was great to have you on and to hear your experiences and to share so open and honestly and vulnerably with us all, which is very helpful. Thank you.